The first thing they said about Nesta, when they said anything at all, was that she was quiet. In the holding of Ashvale, this was not a compliment. Ashvale was a place that valued noise, the noise of its market, its forges, its training yards, where the young men of the pack proved themselves against each other from the age of 10. Quiet, in Ashvale, meant you had nothing worth saying. It meant you lacked the kind of force that a pack required. Nesta's father had been quiet in the same way, and the pack had said the same things about him. And when the fever took him in her 14th year, she had understood, with the clarity of a girl who has always paid close attention, that the pack would now say those things about her. She was not weak. She had never been weak, but she had learned, very young, that the particular strength she possessed was invisible to people who were looking for a different kind. What Nesta could do was this. She could walk into any room and within the space of a few minutes understand every relationship in it. Not through any gift she could name, simply through the quality of her attention, which was total and unhurried and missed nothing. She noticed which men stood nearest the door, which women's eyes went to which other women before they answered a question. She noticed the difference between the silence of someone who had nothing to say and the silence of someone who was choosing not to say it, which was a difference most people never bothered to learn. She had been noticing these things since she was old enough to be in rooms, and the knowledge had accumulated in her the way water accumulates in low ground, quietly, invisibly, until the moment when the ground can hold no more. None of this made her useful to the pack in any way the pack could measure. She was not a fighter. She could not shift. A fact that had marked her since her 16th year, when every other young person in her cohort had felt the change, and she had felt nothing except a faint warmth in her hands that came and went without meaning. She had been made a scribe's assistant at 17. Which was the holding's polite way of giving her a function that required no power she did not have. And she had been a scribe's assistant for 8 years, which was the holding's way of forgetting she existed. She was 25 when the selection came to Ashvale. The selection arrived in the form of 3 riders, wearing the grey and black of the Northern Crown, Theobald's colours, the colours of the Alpha King who had held sovereignty over the 6 northern holdings for the past 12 years. The message they carried was formal and precise. The Alpha King was choosing his queen. Each holding of the Northern Crown was to send one candidate for the presentation at midsummer. The candidate must be of pack blood, unmarried, and of age. The selection was the Alpha King's ancient right, and no holding had ever declined to participate without consequence. The holding council met for 3 days. Nesta heard about their discussions the way she heard about most things, through the quality of the silences around her, through the particular way the council's secretary, old Fenn, stopped talking when she entered the archive room where she worked. On the 4th day, the council's head, Lord Aldgate, summoned her to his hall. He did not ask her, he told her. The holding was sending her. She looked at him for a moment, absorbing the specific shape of what was happening. Why, she said, not because she did not know. She wanted to hear him say it. Aldgate was a large man who was accustomed to being looked at without this quality of attention. He shifted slightly in his chair. You are of pack blood. You are unmarried. You are of age. There are 14 women in this holding who meet those criteria. None of the others can be spared. It was the truest thing he had said. She was, in the council's assessment, the most expendable person of eligible age in Ashvale. She was being sent to the Alpha King's court, not as a candidate, but as a body filling the required slot, the holding's way of complying with the decree, without risking anyone they valued. Nesta looked at Lord Aldgate for a long moment. "When do I leave?" she said. She did not phrase it as a question. The Northern Crown's stronghold was called Gravane, and it was everything Ashvale was not. Ashvale was a working holding, practical, modest, its building scaled to function rather than impression. Greyvane was the kind of place that had been built to make people understand, before a single word was spoken, the distance between themselves and the man who lived there. Its walls were 40 feet of grey-black granite, worn smooth by centuries of northern weather, to a surface that looked almost polished. Its gates were iron, and not timber. Its great hall, which Nesta saw first on the morning of the presentation, had a ceiling high enough that she could not make out the carvings in the vault above the torches. There were 11 candidates. Nesta arrived last, having stopped on the road to help a cart horse that had gone lame 3 miles from the stronghold gates. She had known how to treat a horse's lower leg since she was 12. Her father had taught her. And the animal's distress had been audible, and she was constitutionally incapable of walking past a fixable thing. She arrived at the presentation hall, still in her travelling clothes, with mud on the hem of her cloak and her dark hair pinned only approximately. The other 10 candidates were dressed in their holding's finest. The Alpha King's steward looked at Nesta with an expression that suggested he was revising a list in his head. Theobald stood at the end of the hall. She had heard descriptions of him. She had made it her business to read everything in the archive that touched on the Alpha King of the Northern Crown. 12 years on the throne, decisive military record, known for a quality of stillness that his allies called authority, and his enemies called coldness. She had read all of this and formed a picture of a man who had grown so accustomed to the world bending to his will that he had forgotten it was a choice the world was making. The picture had not been wrong, exactly, but she had not accounted for his presence, which was the kind of thing that descriptions could gesture toward without capturing. He was tall in the way of the northern bloodlines, with dark colouring and the particular bearing of someone who has been a threat to everything around him for long enough that it no longer requires effort. He had a scar. She noted it immediately, force of habit, running from his left temple to the edge of his jaw, pale and old, a battle mark from the campaign in his 23rd year by her reading of the archive. His eyes, when they swept the line of candidates and paused, briefly, at her, were a dark amber she had not expected. Not cold, not calculating, but something else. Something that was still deciding. The pause lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he moved on. She filed this. The presentation was ceremonial and efficient. Each candidate's name and holdings spoken aloud by the steward. A brief assessment from Theobald that communicated nothing to the candidates, and Nesta suspected very little to Theobald either. He had dismissed 7 of them before the names were finished. She could tell by the specific quality of his attention, which shifted after each brief encounter, from the candidate to some middle distance that had nothing to do with the room. He was going through a procedure. He was not yet engaged. She was the last name called. She walked the length of the hall, with the mud still on her cloak hem, and the awareness of every pair of eyes in the room, and the particular quality of observation she brought to every space she entered, which meant that she registered, among other things, that 2 of Theobald's inner guard had subtly shifted position when she began walking, that the steward had drawn a small breath, that one of the other candidates, a tall, fair-haired woman from the easternmost holding, was watching Nesta's walk, with an expression that suggested she was recalibrating, something she had assumed. Nesta stopped at the correct distance and looked at Theobald directly. He looked back. She watched him read her. The mud, the travelling clothes, the inadequate hair. She watched the conclusion form in his expression before it reached his words, which came 2 seconds later. In a tone of voice she recognized as polite dismissal, wearing the clothes of assessment. "You are from Ashvale. The scribe's holding. I work in the archive, yes. You have no combat rank. No. You arrived late to the presentation, and your appearance suggests you have not prepared. Nesta looked at him for a moment. The amber eyes were assessing. The scar along his jaw caught the torchlight from the left. She noticed that he was doing the thing people in authority frequently did, which was reading the surface of a thing and calling it the whole. I stopped to help a lame horse on the road, she said. The animal was in pain, and the driver did not know the correct treatment. I knew it. I stopped. You prioritized a horse over the Alpha King's presentation. I prioritized a suffering creature over my own convenience, she said. If those are the same thing in your assessment, that tells me something useful. The hall was very quiet. The quality of the quiet was the quality of people who are not certain whether they have just witnessed someone's end or someone's beginning. Theobald looked at her for a long moment. Longer than he had looked at any of the other candidates. The amber eyes were doing the thing she had noticed when she first saw him, still deciding. You are dismissed, he said. She held his gaze for one beat longer than was advisable. Then she turned and walked back down the hall. She was not afraid. She was paying attention. They kept all 11 candidates at Gravane for a period of evaluation. This was the selection's second phase, in which the Alpha King's Council assessed the candidates' suitability over a period of 14 days. Nesta had read about this phase in the archive, which described it in terms of lineage, verification, and temperament observation, which she understood to mean that the council watched the candidates, and the candidates watched each other, and everyone watched Theobald, who gave nothing away. On the second day of evaluation, a problem presented itself, as two of the candidates had developed a rivalry. Not a new thing, apparently. They were from neighbouring holdings with a long history of competing claims on a border stretch of forest. By the morning of the third day, the rivalry had acquired physical weight. Nesta arrived at the great hall before breakfast to find one of them, a young woman named Gressida, sitting on the stone floor outside the hall, with a split lip and a cut above her right eye, that had been cleaned but not dressed, and the specific expression of someone who has decided not to report a thing, because reporting it will cost them more than enduring it. Nesta sat down beside her on the stone floor and said nothing for a moment. Not because she did not know what to say, but because she had learned over a lifetime of paying attention, showed that the first 30 seconds of sitting beside someone in pain were better spent in silence, because silence signaled that you were not in a hurry to have the thing resolved and move on. It was the hurry to move on that made people feel like problems rather than people. After 30 seconds, she said, "Tell me what happened. Not, do you need help? Not, are you all right?" Those questions gave people the option of lying, and Gressida's face suggested she would take that option. Gressida told her, in flat economical sentences, that the other candidate, Marcel, from the rival holding, had followed her from the Great Hall to the Eastern Corridor after the second evening meal, with two of her holding's women behind her, and had used the specific geometry of a corridor. Narrow, no exits except the two ends. To make clear that Gressida's continued presence in the evaluation was not welcome. The shove against the stone wall had come at the end of a conversation. There were no neutral witnesses. There would be no report, because a report required witnesses, and because Marcel's holding outranked Gressida's in the formal council structure, and everyone at Gravane knew it. Nesta listened to all of it, and while she listened, she dressed the cut above Gressida's eye with a strip of clean linen from her belt pouch, which she carried the way she carried most things she might need. Because it was sensible, not because she had anticipated this specific use. Gressida held still for this without being asked. Will it happen again? Nesta said. If she thinks it's working. Yes. Tell me before the next time, Nesta said. Before it reaches the corridor. Cressida looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been offered help without strings attached and is trying to locate the strings. Why? Because I have been watching Marcel since we arrived, Nesta said, and I think I know what she actually wants, which is different from what she is doing to get it. She was right. Marcel's aggression was not temperamental. It was a tool she used when she felt cornered, and what was cornering her was not Cressida, but the wool tariff dispute between their holdings, which had been unresolved for 40 years and which Marcel had apparently decided to treat as a personal affront requiring a personal resolution. Strategic aggression has tells. Now Nesta had learned them early, the way the body orients toward the target before the mind has finished deciding, the specific quality of attention that is not curiosity but calculation. She spent the next 2 days watching, and on the 4th day of evaluation, in the great hall before the midday meal, when Marcel moved to position herself, next to Cressida, in a configuration Nesta recognized immediately. The arrangement of bodies that preceded a public humiliation, designed to happen in full view of enough witnesses to make Cressida feel the weight of her lower status. Nesta stepped into the space between them, with the particular physical ease of someone who occupies a room rather than simply being in it, and began talking to both of them simultaneously. To Cressida, about her holdings' livestock management, the which was genuinely interesting. To Marcel, about the wool tariff, the specific economic clause in the original border agreement, the transcription error in Ashvale's archive that had been propagating through correspondence for 40 years, the resolution that was simpler than anyone had made it seem. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. By the end of it, Marcel was not thinking about humiliating Cressida. She was thinking about the letter she needed to write to her holdings council. Nesta filed this exchange away and said nothing about it to anyone. What she did not know was that Theobald's inner guard maintained a presence in the great hall at all times, including meal times, including conversations that looked like nothing in particular. On the 7th day of evaluation, the candidates were brought to the training yards for what the steward described as an observation of physical capability. Nesta had known this was coming. The archive described it, and had spent 7 days forming an accurate assessment of what she would and would not be able to do in a training yard, which was approximately nothing that would impress anyone, and everything that would confirm Theobald's initial read of her as a woman without the pack's usual markings of strength. She was correct. The other 10 candidates shifted, most of them, into the first stages of wolf form with the kind of ease that comes from a lifetime of practice. 3 were accomplished fighters in human form as well. 2 had combat honors from their home holdings, and demonstrated this with the particular pleasure of people who have rarely been given a formal stage on which to demonstrate it. Nesta stood at the edge of the yard, watched all of this with her full attention, and did not shift. When the steward reached her in his tour of the yard, she said, before he could ask, "I have not been able to shift since my 16th year. I am aware of what this means in terms of this assessment. I would ask that it not be taken as evidence of weakness, which is not the same thing as an inability to shift." The steward opened his mouth, then closed it. What happened next was not planned, and its origin was probably Marcel, whose humiliation in the great hall 3 days prior had not resolved her underlying resentment as thoroughly as the wool tariff conversation had suggested. And Marcel stepped from the sparring circle with the residue of a training bout still in her body, the particular physical heightening of someone who has just proved something, and said, loud enough for the yard to hear, "The archive girl can't shift. She will be returned to Ashvale by the end of the week." Several people in the training yard laughed. The laughter had the specific quality of people who are not sure if it is permitted and have decided to chance it. Nesta did not move. She did not flush or flinch or make any of the adjustments that public mockery usually produced. She simply looked at Marcel with the full grey-green attention she brought to everything, and said mildly, "The letter to your Holdings Council about the wool tariff. Have you written it yet?" The laughter stopped. Marcel stared at her. The transcription error in the original border agreement," Nesta said. "Section 9, Clause 4, 40 years of a dispute that resolves with a single acknowledged correction. I mentioned it on the 4th day." She paused. "I would write it before you leave Gravane, if I were you. The resolution is simpler than arbitration." Marcel's face went through several things. Then she turned and walked back to the sparring circle. The yard was very quiet for a moment. Then, from one of the inner guards standing at the wall, there was a sound that was not quite a laugh, but shared certain characteristics with one. He controlled it immediately. He was, Nesta noted, one of the two who had shifted position when she first walked down the presentation hall. From the far side of the yard, but she was always aware, of Theobald watching. He had been watching the entire exercise from a raised position near the wall, with the stillness that was apparently his default state, and he had not shifted either, which was a fact she had filed on the second day when she noticed that his wolf was never visible while the candidates were present. She had a theory about why, and the theory was this: a wolf knows its own. The Alpha King's wolf would not be made visible to a room full of candidates who were being assessed for fitness to stand beside it, because the wolf's response was not a tool of selection. It was the truth of a thing. And premature truth was the most disruptive kind. He was protecting the process from itself, or protecting his wolf from having to perform. She considered this to be, key on the evidence available, a reasonable way to think about the problem. On the 9th day, her theory was tested. The stronghold had a lower ward, a courtyard between the inner and outer walls, where the pack's working wolves ran freely, the domestic working animals that were not fighters, but scouts, message carriers, herders of the pack's livestock. Nesta had been spending an hour there each morning before the day's evaluation activities, which no one had told her to do, and no one had told her not to do, because she had discovered on her second day that the lower ward was where the information the stronghold ran on actually travelled, not through the formal channels of the council room, but through the handlers and the kennel keepers and the 2 old women who prepared the working wolves' feed, who between them knew everything about everyone within the walls. On the 9th morning, she was in the lower ward at her usual hour, when the working wolves went still, all of them at once, 12 animals ranging from the size of a large dog to the size of a small horse, all of them ceasing whatever they were doing, the pacing, the eating, the low interactions with each other, and orienting toward the inner wall gate. Not with the body language of threat, with the body language of recognition. Nesta stayed where she was. The gate opened and Theobald walked through. He was not in his formal appearance. No riding cloak, no council garments. A plain dark tunic, leather worn at the elbows. He stopped when he saw her. She looked at him. He looked at her. So the working wolves held their stillness between them, like something cupped in 2 hands. "You come here every morning," he said. It was not a question. Yes. Why? Because the women who prepare the feed know more about this stronghold than anyone in your council chamber, Nesta said. And they will talk to someone who comes to listen, which is different from someone who comes to learn something specific. The amber eyes. The quality of still deciding. You cannot shift, he said. No. And you are here every morning with the working wolves. They don't require that I shift, she said. They require that I pay attention. Theobald was quiet for a moment. One of the working wolves, a mid-sized grey with a white flash at the throat, had moved during this conversation to stand beside Nesta's left knee, not asking anything of her. Simply there. He looked at the wolf, then at Nesta. The way he had not yet looked at her in the open, the full attention he had been distributing in careful fractions across 14 days of observation. In the morning light, she was striking in the way of things that do not arrange themselves for the purpose. Dark hair, very dark, worn simply back from a face of considerable precision. The high line of her cheekbones, the jaw that held its angle with a clarity that was neither soft nor sharp, but simply exact, and the grey-green eyes that had been looking at everything in his stronghold, with that quality of total, unhurried attention that he had, over 14 mornings, come to recognize as the most honest thing about her. Her skin was pale northern pale, with the clarity of someone who spent time outdoors without thinking about it, and she was tall in a way that was almost invisible, because she made no use of it. Simply upright. The posture of someone who had decided that standing straight was the least she could do for herself and had held it ever since. He was aware that he had dismissed this at the presentation. He was aware of why he had dismissed it, which was that he had been looking for a different kind of visible, and she had refused to provide it. I dismissed you. At the presentation, he said. Yes. That was, he said, with a quality in his voice she had not heard from him before. Not uncertainty, not apology, but the specific weight of a man revising a position and choosing to say so rather than simply changing it without acknowledgement. How premature. She did not say anything for a moment. The grey wolf was warm against her knee. You dismissed what you could see, she said finally. That is not the same as what is there. The 14th day of evaluation was the last. The council would present their assessment to Theobald, who would make his decision, and the candidates who were not chosen would return to their holdings. Nesta had spent 14 days doing what she always did, paying attention, filing what she learned, acting on the small things that were in front of her and that she could fix. She had stopped Marcel's campaign against Gressida, without Marcel understanding what had happened. She had spent her mornings in the lower ward and built by increments a complete map of the stronghold's actual power structure. Not the formal hierarchy of the council, but the web of relationships and obligations and old agreements that made the stronghold function. She had talked to the kennel keepers and the feed women and the 2 scribes who maintained Greyvane's archive, which she had found on the 4th day to be in a state of some disorder, and had spent 3 of her evaluation evenings reorganizing a section of it, that the head scribe, a tired man named Walcott, had been unable to get to for 6 years. Walcott had gone to the steward. The steward had gone to the council. The council had added a note to her assessment. What Nesta had not done was perform. She had not positioned herself strategically near Theobald, had not engineered encounters. I had not done any of the things that 3 of the other candidates were clearly doing with practiced efficiency. She was constitutionally uninterested in being seen doing a thing. She was only interested in the thing. On the morning of the 14th day, she was in the lower ward at her usual hour, when Theobald arrived, as he had arrived every morning since the 9th day, at the same time, by the same gate. The working wolves had taken to meeting him at the gate now, not out of his authority over them. He had said nothing to encourage this, but because he had, over 5 mornings, begun doing what Nesta did, arriving and paying attention, sitting on the lower ward's wooden bench, while the wolves went about their business, asking nothing. She had watched him learn this. She had not commented on it. Yet on this morning he sat on the bench and she sat beside him. The working wolves moving around them in the patterns they had established over 2 weeks, and Theobald said, "Tell me what you know about the wool tariff dispute between Marcel's holding and Gressida's." Nesta looked at him. "You heard that conversation," she said. "My guard reported it. I wanted the detail." She told him. The tariff's actual history, the misread council record in both holdings, the specific clause that had been transcribed incorrectly in Ashvale's archive 40 years ago, and that had propagated through 3 generations of correspondence. The resolution was simple, a correction of the original transcription, formally acknowledged by both holdings councils. It would not require arbitration, it would require a letter. Theobald listened to all of it without speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How long have you known this?" "Since the 4th day." "Why did you not bring it to the council?" "Because it was not mine to bring," she said. "It was Marcel's and Gressida's. I gave them the information. What they do with it is their decision. The council's role is arbitration, when parties cannot reach agreement," Nesta said. "These parties had not yet tried. I thought they should be given the chance. If they fail, the council is still there." He looked at her with the amber eyes that had been deciding for 14 days. "You have been in this stronghold for 2 weeks," he said. "You have resolved a holding dispute, reorganized a section of my archive, and established a daily intelligence gathering practice in my lower ward that has produced a more accurate map of my stronghold's actual function than anything my council has provided in 12 years. And you have done all of this without once seeking credit for any of it." "I was not seeking credit. I was keeping myself occupied. Nesta." The first time he had used her name, without her title or her holding's name, it landed differently. "I dismissed you at the presentation as someone who had no power worth measuring. I need you to know that I was wrong." She looked at the grey wolf with the white flash, who was dozing against her feet in the morning light. "You were measuring the wrong things," she said. "Yes," Theobald said. He paused. "The selection process does not accommodate what you are. I find that the process may need revision." She looked at him then. The full grey-green attention she had been giving everything in this stronghold for 14 days. Now entirely on him. He received it without looking away, which not many people did. "I am not interested in being a queen as a title," she said. "I am interested in whether the work is real, whether it matters. It would be the most real work in the Northern Crown," he said quietly. "And it has been going undone for 12 years, because I did not know what I was looking for." The lower ward was quiet around them. The working wolves moved in their slow morning patterns. The grey wolf, with the white flash, opened one eye, assessed the conversation and closed it again. Nesta thought about Ashvale and the archive, and old Fen stopping talking when she entered a room. She thought about her father's quiet, and the way the pack had named it weakness, when it was in fact simply a different kind of seeing. "Ask me properly," she said. Not as the Alpha King asking a selection candidate, as a person asking another person. Theobald looked at her. Nesta held his gaze the way she held everything. Fully, without performance, with the attention she gave to things she considered worth understanding. He was, she had decided over 14 mornings in the lower ward, a man who had carried his authority alone for long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight of it. Not because he was indifferent to the weight, but because there had been no one beside him to notice he was carrying it. 12 years. The archive had said 12 years on the throne, and she had read that as political fact, but now she read it as a different kind of fact. Theobald was quiet for a moment. that had the quality of a man who has not been asked to make himself ordinary in a very long time and is discovering, with something between relief and difficulty, that he is willing to do it. "Nesta," he said, "would you stay?" She looked at him for a long time. The morning light was coming over the inner wall, cold and clear, and the grey wolf was warm against her feet, and the stronghold was waking around them with all the thousand small sounds of a place that was in fact quite well organized once you understood its actual structure. "Yes," she said. She did not say, "I have been staying since the 9th day." She did not say, "The lower ward is already mine, and the archive, and the information the stronghold runs on." She did not say, "I have known the shape of this answer for a week." She said yes. That was enough. What happened in the great hall happened the next morning, and Nesta had not planned it, which was the only reason it surprised her. Theobald had summoned the full pack, the inner guard, the council, the handlers and kennel keepers and scribes, the working wolves and their handlers, the feed women from the lower ward, the head scribe Walcott and his 2 assistants, the entire household, and the 10 remaining selection candidates who were, to a person, aware that an announcement was coming and were managing this awareness in their own ways, to the great hall to hear the selection's conclusion. This was traditional. The Alpha King stood before the assembled pack and spoke, and the pack listened, and what was said became the truth of the Northern Crown. Nesta stood beside Theobald on the dais. This was also traditional. The chosen candidate stood beside the Alpha King for the announcement. She had read this in the archive, what the archive had not conveyed, because the archive was written by people who had been in this position before and had not thought to note it because it seemed obvious, was the specific quality of standing in front of every person in a stronghold while they formed their assessment of you. The council members' faces, the inner guard's careful neutrality. Marcel, at the back, whose expression Nesta read without difficulty as the specific recalibration of someone who had been wrong about the outcome and is revising their understanding of why. The announcement was brief. By Theobald spoke with the economy of a man who had always known that his words carried weight and had stopped needing to demonstrate it. Nesta was named, her position was stated, the holding of her origin was stated. Her lack of combat rank and her inability to shift were not mentioned because they were not relevant to what was being announced, which was a decision about what the Northern Crown needed, and Theobald had made the decision. It was when he finished speaking that the thing happened. The grey wolf, with the white flash, who was in the great hall, because the working wolves were part of the pack, and the pack had been summoned, padded from its position near the hall's east wall to the dais. It reached the dais, looked up at Nesta, and lowered its head, not in the formal submission posture of wolves acknowledging the Alpha King. Something different, the head drop of a creature choosing to honor a specific person's quality. And then, in the particular silence that follows an unusual thing, the other working wolves did the same. One by one, then in groups, then... And this was the part that made the great hall go fully and completely silent. The inner guard wolves, who were among the most formally trained animals in the Northern Crown, and who did not perform ceremony without command. Theobald had not commanded this. Nesta stood very still on the dais and felt the weight of it. Not the ceremony of it, but the actual weight, which was the weight of being seen by every creature in the room that made its judgments honestly and without agenda. Wolves did not perform. Wolves paid attention and responded to what they found. Once she had been paying attention to them for 14 days. They had been paying attention to her. Theobald, standing beside her, said nothing for a long time. When he did speak, it was very quietly, only for her. "I told you I was wrong." "You did," she said. "I did not entirely understand how wrong. She looked at the hall. The wolves with their heads lowered. The council members in their chairs, with the particular expression of people who are revising something fundamental. Cressida, near the back wall with tears on her face, that she clearly thought she was hiding. The feed women from the lower ward, who were not hiding anything at all. The pack knows what it knows, she said. It doesn't need to be told. Theobald looked at her then with the amber eyes that had been deciding since the moment she walked into his hall with mud on her cloak and a horse's treatment in her hands. And what was in them now was not decision. The deciding was done. No, he said. It doesn't. The grey wolf with the white flash had not moved from the dais. Neither had Nesta. The morning light came through the hall's high windows in long cold slabs, and the pack's wolves held their heads down, and the Northern Crown had its queen,